Tell me, what are your thoughts, your fears about this reopening?
Well, I think that everyone wants schools to open and to stay open so that young people and children whose education has been so disrupted can get back, they can start learning, and they can start getting into a routine. I think that's really important. And that's what teachers and leaders want, because they found remote education really difficult, and they know that disadvantaged children really suffered during that period. So everyone wants it to work. My concerns are that given that COVID levels are now 26 times higher now than they were at this point last year, and given that the restrictions in school, the safety measures have been so reduced, my concern is that much as we want the new term to go well and pupils to remain in school, remain learning, rather quickly, far too many of them will have to isolate because they've caught COVID, and that will disrupt their education again.
Okay, I want to come to the problems of COVID, continuing problems of COVID, and how well schools are going to be able to cope with that in just a second. But on this question you mentioned there of so many children falling behind in their learning, especially those from disadvantaged households, how do you think the teachers that you represent are going to cope with that? Because it means, I don't know, speeding up the learning of a lot of children appearing for school in these coming days, while just carrying on with the curriculum.
Well, you can't just carry on with, teachers don't just carry on with the curriculum if children don't understand it.
Yeah.
So what teachers will be doing is they will be looking at the curriculum and looking at what are the essential areas of knowledge that children and young people need to know in order to progress. We have a very packed curriculum in terms of curriculum content, so they'll be looking at what are the really essential areas of the curriculum which they need to know. They would be helped if the government had announced now what GCSEs and A-levels are going to look like next year. But yet again, those announcements are delayed, and that does make it much more difficult for teachers. But, you know, they're very experienced in diagnosing where children are at, where young people are at, diagnosing what they need to learn in order to progress, and they'll be doing that as hard and as well as they can in the coming year.
Yeah, well, you're clearly not convinced that the new system of restrictions dealing with COVID are going to be enough. You don't have faith, Mary, that a system led by testing with fewer controls on distancing and all that sort of thing, masks and so on, you don't think that's going to cut it?
I'm afraid that it won't. I mean, I hope that I'm wrong, actually. I really do. But if you look at what's happened in Scotland, where they have retained mask wearing as well, they've been back at school since August the 8th. And the levels of infection for 16-year-olds now are 3 times higher than they were when those pupils went back to school. And, you know, COVID doesn't recognise national boundaries. So in England, we're going back. There are far fewer safety measures in schools. The government's stopped the requirement for mask wearing, and there was a research study last week, very authoritative one, which said that mask wearing is the second most effective way of suppressing transmission of the virus. Good ventilation is the most effective way. So I don't understand why mask wearing has been abandoned in secondary schools. I don't understand why the government hasn't made it the case that air filtration units are in classrooms and areas of the school where there's very poor ventilation, because we know that's the most effective way of suppressing transmission. And, you know, the government and ministers keep saying it's so important and education is so important. Well, that's absolutely right. But we want deeds as well as words, and the deeds need to be what is needed to suppress transmission in schools, and they haven't come up with the goods. Yeah,
I mean, it is argued that, you know, since the start of the summer break, so many more of us have been vaccinated. You know, a huge majority of people now have double vaccinations or at least single vaccinations, and so the risk is less now, and we need fewer restrictions. What do you say to that?
Well, that's undoubtedly true. Vaccination has been an absolute game changer, and it makes the working lives of teachers and adults in school much more secure. But children aren't vaccinated. So the issue about children in school is not that the vast majority of them will be ill with COVID. Quite a lot of them will be asymptomatic, and when they are diagnosed, many will have very mild symptoms. The problem is if they're diagnosed with COVID, if they are infected, then they have to isolate, and their education will be disrupted. The other problem is that they will raise COVID infection levels in the community, and vulnerable people can still catch COVID. You can still catch COVID if you're a teacher. You're not likely to be hospitalised, but you're going to have to be absent because you've caught COVID in school. So if you don't lower transmission levels in school, the likelihood in 3 or 4 weeks' time is that there'll be lots of children and young people missing school, which they really cannot afford to do because they've caught COVID. They won't be ill, but they'll be at home.
All right. And lastly, it is also suggested that it might be better to let the infection run through schools, do what it does during the summer, during the warmer weeks and months, than wait for the winter when the consequences would be so much worse.
Well, there is an argument around all of that, but my view is that if you let it rip, what that means, again, is that those school populations where it's been let rip will be absent from school. And we know that there is a bigger level of absence in areas of the country which are deprived because children live in more crowded households, and they get higher rates of COVID infection. So the pattern that we saw last year of the children who most need to be in school, who are living in the most deprived homes in the most deprived areas, are most likely not to be getting the education that they need because they've got COVID. So if you let infection rip, that means that the very objective that we all should be aiming for, which is keeping children in school and keeping them learning, is less likely to happen in too many cases.